At the morning count on the 12th of June 1962, a guard on Alcatraz reached through the bars to wake a prisoner who had not moved, and the man's head rolled off the pillow onto the floor. It was not a man, it was plaster and paint and human hair, and the cell behind it was empty, so were two others. This video is about what happened in the 10 months before that morning and the 60-odd years since. How 3 men got out of the prison that existed specifically so that nobody could, what was found in the water afterwards, and why 2 federal agencies looking at exactly the same short list of evidence reached opposite conclusions and have never reconciled them. Frank Morris and the brothers John and Clarence Anglin left their cells that night through holes they had spent months widening at the back, climbed a utility corridor to the roof, went down the outside of the building, crossed the perimeter, and put a raft in the water on the north shore of the island. Nobody has ever found them, not a body, not an arrest, not a confirmed sighting in 63 years. The case is still formally open with the United States Marshals Service, and it will stay open until the youngest of the 3 would be 99 years old. Alcatraz existed to be the place you could not leave. It was a military prison first, and the federal government took it over in 1934 specifically as the institution that would hold the men other institutions could not. The escape risks, the ones with money and organization behind them, the ones who had already got out of somewhere else. The design was not really about walls, it was about water. 1.25 miles of San Francisco Bay, tidal, cold all year, with currents running hard through the Golden Gate twice a day in each direction. The prison authorities were happy for people to believe the bay was full of sharks, which was a useful exaggeration. The real deterrent was the temperature and the tide, and neither of those needed exaggerating. It operated as a federal prison for 29 years, and in that time 36 men made 14 separate attempts to get off the island. Most were caught on the rock within hours, a handful were shot, 2 drowned and were recovered. 5 went into the water and were never accounted for at all, and 3 of those 5 are the men in this video. And here is the question I want to put to you before we go any further, because everything after this is evidence for both sides of it, and you should notice which way you are already leaning. The Bureau investigated this for 17 years and closed it, concluding the 3 men drowned. The Marshals Service took it over and has kept it open ever since, on the view that they may not have. Same island, same night, same short list of objects pulled out of the water. So which is it, and more usefully, what would it actually take to change your mind? Start with the 2 men who are not in this story but should be, because they set the precedent that the Bureau leaned on in 1979. In December 1937, Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe cut through a window in the mat shop, went down to the water in heavy fog during a storm, and were never seen again. They were officially presumed drowned, and the conditions that day make that a reasonable presumption: a bad storm, a strong ebb, and 2 men in the water in December. But it is a presumption, not a finding. There were reported sightings of Cole and Rowe for years afterwards, in South America among other places, and none of them ever stood up either. There was also an attempt in 1946 that failed badly, ran for 2 days, and ended with the Marines being called onto the island. That one is remembered for how violent it became. What matters here is what the institution took from it, which was that a determined group could get out of the cells and into the cell house, and that the thing which actually stopped them was that there was nowhere to go. So by 1962, Alcatraz had a working theory of itself, and the theory was correct in every part but one: men could get out of a cell. Men could get out of the building. Nobody had ever got off the island, and therefore the reasoning went nobody would. The prison had stopped treating the water as a barrier that needed maintaining and started treating it as a barrier that maintained itself. Olin Blackwell, the warden, had been in the job less than a year when it happened. He inherited an institution that was falling apart in a very literal sense, and that detail matters more than it sounds, because it is the reason the escape was possible at all. The building was concrete, put up in 1912, sitting in salt air and salt spray for 50 years. The concrete at the back of the cells, around the ventilation grills, had degraded to the point where it could be worked with hand tools. Staff knew the structure was failing. There was a proposal to replace the cell house entirely. There was no money for it. There was no money for it because Alcatraz was extraordinarily expensive. It had no fresh water of its own, so something like 1 million gallons a week had to be barged out to it, along with everything else the island consumed. It ran at roughly 1 officer for every 3 prisoners, which is a ratio no ordinary institution could justify. It cost roughly 3 times as much to run as any other federal prison. That is worth holding on to, because it means the security everybody remembers was not really a system. It was a location, plus a staffing level, plus a building that was quietly failing, and the location was doing most of the work. The counting, on the other hand, was a system, and a good one. Prisoners were counted a dozen or more times a day, at fixed points, and the count was the spine of the whole regime. Nothing at Alcatraz moved until the numbers matched. Which means that if you want a head start measured in hours rather than minutes, the count is the only thing you actually have to defeat. 4 men planned it and 3 of them got out. They were not a gang and they had not known each other on the outside. They were put next to each other on B block, which is the sort of administrative accident this whole story turns on. Frank Morris, a career bank robber with a tested IQ reported at around 133, is generally treated as the planner, and the record broadly supports that. He had been in institutions since he was a teenager. He had got out of one in Louisiana before, and he arrived at Alcatraz in 1960 as precisely the kind of prisoner it existed to hold. John Anglin, the older of the 2 brothers, had been sent to Alcatraz in 1960 after trying to get out of 2 other federal prisons. He and his brother had grown up in a large family of seasonal farm workers in Florida, and they had been convicted together for robbing a bank in Alabama. Clarence Anglin arrived a few months after his brother. The pair of them are the reason the human side of this case has stayed alive for 6 decades, because they had a family who never accepted the official conclusion and who have gone on saying so publicly across 3 generations. It is worth saying plainly what these men were and were not. They were robbers. They were not, on any reading of their records, dangerous in the way the Alcatraz legend implies, and none of the 3 had a history of harming anybody. What put them on that island was not what they had done, it was that they kept leaving other prisons. Alan West, the 4th man, is the reason anybody knows how it was done. West did not get out. His ventilation grill had been cemented around the edges during a repair, and it would not come free in time. By the moment he had worked it loose, the other 3 had gone. He then told investigators the entire plan, in detail, across a long series of interviews. That is worth pausing on because it makes West both the best source in the case and the least reliable one. Everything known about the mechanics comes from a man with an obvious interest in presenting himself as central to a plan he did not finish, talking to the people investigating him with nothing else to trade. The physical evidence in the cells corroborates most of what he said. It does not corroborate all of it, and there is no second witness anywhere. The digging took months, and a good deal of it was done with cutlery. The target was the ventilation grill at the back of each cell, set into the wall at floor level, opening into a utility corridor that ran up the back of the cell block carrying the pipes and wiring. The grill itself was smaller. The point was never to remove it, but to enlarge the opening around it by chipping away the softened concrete until a man could get through. They worked with sharpened spoons taken from the mess hall, with a drill improvised from the motor of a stolen vacuum cleaner, and with whatever else could be carried out of the workshops without being missed. They worked at it for something like 6 months, during the evening music hour, when the noise of instruments across the block covered the sound of the work. One man dug while another watched the corridor for staff. The debris went out in trouser pockets and into the bay, a pocketful at a time. And each night the whole had to disappear. They made false walls out of painted cardboard and soap, and whatever pigment could be got from the workshops, fitted over the openings and touched in to match. By all accounts, these were good enough to survive routine inspection from the front of a cell in poor light. Nobody was crawling behind the bunks each evening to check. That is the part of the story that is genuinely damning about the institution rather than impressive about the men. The escape did not defeat a security system. It exploited a building everybody knew was failing, on a wing where the routine inspection was visual and taken from a distance, in an institution whose confidence rested on the water rather than on the concrete. There is a second institutional failure inside that one, and it is the more interesting of the two. The utility corridor the men were opening into was not a secret. It was a known space, it ran the height of the block, and it was not searched with any regularity because there was no reason to think anybody could get into it. The moment the concrete softened, the corridor stopped being a maintenance space and became a road, and nothing in the regime was set up to notice the difference. The heads are the part everybody remembers, and they deserve the attention because they are the reason the head start was as long as it was. The plan needed the count to pass, and the count was done by looking through the bars at a sleeping figure. So they built figures. The heads were made from a mixture that included soap, toilet paper, cement dust and paint taken from the workshops, and they were finished with real hair collected off the floor of the prison barbershop. They made 4 heads in all, 1 for each conspirator, and the 4th was never used. They were not works of art, and they did not need to be. Seen from a corridor in the dark on a pillow, above a shaped bundle of clothing they held. Anybody who has seen the surviving heads in a museum case under bright light finds this hard to believe, and that reaction is a good lesson about evidence. The question is never whether an object convinces you now, it is whether it had to convince somebody tired at night walking past, expecting to see a man. And they held not for an hour but through the entire night, which is what turned a breakout into a genuine disappearance. By the time anybody knew, the 3 men had somewhere between 7 and 9 hours on the water and on whatever land lay beyond it. The raft was made out of raincoats. This is the detail that sounds like invention and is in fact the best documented thing in the entire case, because pieces of it were recovered from the bay. Prison-issue rubberized raincoats were collected or stolen over a period of months from other prisoners and from stores. Something like 50 raincoats went into it. The material was cut and shaped in the space above the cell block, on top of the utility corridor, which the men had reached through their holes and turned into a workshop nobody was visiting. The seams were sealed with hate. Steam pipes ran through that space, and the rubberized fabric could be bonded by pressing it against a hot pipe, which is a genuinely clever answer to the one problem a raft made of coats has. They built a raft of roughly 14 feet by 6, with life vests to go with it, and a set of wooden paddles from the workshops. To inflate it they used a concertina. Morris had a musical instrument permitted, which he modified into a bellows. That is why the digging happened during music hour, and it is why nobody thought twice about a man with an instrument. Set the romance of it aside for a moment, and look at what that inventory actually tells you. This was not an impulsive break. It was a manufacturing project run for months inside a maximum security prison, requiring the theft and modification of dozens of items across several workshops, coordinated between 4 men who had to trust each other completely, in a building where none of them could speak freely, and any one of them could have traded the whole thing for a transfer. It also tells you something about what they expected. Men who think they are probably going to die do not spend 6 months building life vests and testing a bellows. Whatever the outcome, the plan was built by people who believed the water was survivable with the right equipment, and they had a better sense of that water than most people who have written about them since. On the night of the 11th of June 1962, they went. West could not free his grill, and the other 3 did not wait, which West later described with some bitterness, and which is the single most human detail in the whole record. They went up through the utility corridor to the roof, crossed it, and came down a kitchen vent pipe on the north side of the cell house. Then 2 perimeter fences, and down to the shoreline on the northeast of the island, which is the side facing Angel Island rather than the side facing the city. Alcatraz sits about 1.25 miles from the San Francisco shore. Angel Island to the north is roughly 2 miles. The water in June runs at something around 53 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cold enough to take the strength out of an unprotected swimmer in well under an hour, and the raft was the whole plan for that reason. They put the raft in the water at some point in the late evening. The exact time is not known, and it turns out to be the single most important unknown in the entire case, for reasons the last part of this video is about. The escape was discovered at the morning count. The response was immediate and enormous. The Coast Guard, the Bureau, boats, aircraft, and searches of every shoreline in the bay and every island in it. Roadblocks went up across the North Bay. The families in Florida were put under observation. It was, at that point, one of the largest manhunts the Bureau had ever run. It found nothing, and it is worth being precise about how completely nothing. Not a footprint on a beach that could be tied to them, not a stolen boat, not a house broken into for dry clothes on a night when 3 soaked men needed dry clothes badly. A report of a car stolen in Marin County that night was chased hard and could not be stood up. What was found afterwards is a short list, and it has never grown: a paddle floating. Pieces of rubberized material consistent with the raft and with a life vest, one recovered near Angel Island and one out past the Golden Gate. Nothing else that has ever been confirmed as belonging to the 3 men. A sealed plastic bag was recovered on Angel Island. Wrapped and sealed against the water, it held photographs of the Anglin family, along with names and addresses. It had not been in the bay long, and it was not waterlogged. That bag is the strongest single object in the case, and both sides claim it. If you think they drowned, it is debris from a raft that came apart, and men do not leave behind the one waterproof package they made unless something has gone very wrong. If you think they landed, it is exactly what you would expect: a man coming ashore soaked, stripping to what he can carry and run in, and leaving behind the one item that would identify him and his whole family if he was stopped. Some weeks later, the crew of a Norwegian freighter reported seeing a body in blue clothing in the water outside the Golden Gate. It was not recovered. It was never identified, and it has never been possible to say whether it had anything to do with this at all. That is the entire physical record, and it is worth being blunt that it is thin. A paddle, 2 pieces of coat, a bag of photographs, and a sighting from a ship. 63 years of argument rests on 5 things, none of which is a body and none of which is a person. There is one more thing in Morris's record that the Bureau weighed heavily, and that gets left out of the popular telling. This was not his first time. He had got out of a Louisiana institution years earlier and stayed at liberty for a period before being picked up, which tells you 2 things: that he knew what the days after an escape actually demand, and that he had been caught before doing exactly this. Men who get out once tend to get out again. Men who get out twice tend, eventually, to be recognized. 6 months later, somebody proved the swim could be done. On the 16th of December 1962, 2 prisoners cut through bars in the kitchen basement and went into the water on the west side of the island, using inflated surgical gloves for flotation and nothing else. One of them, Darl Lee Parker, got no further than a small rock outcrop a short way offshore and was picked up there. The other, John Paul Scott, swam the whole way. He was found on the rocks at Fort Point, directly under the Golden Gate Bridge, by 2 teenagers who thought at first they had found a body. Scott had made it to the mainland from Alcatraz in December in colder water than the June the Anglins had, with no raft and no life vest. That is not a theory or a model. It happened, it was documented at the time, and it is the only confirmed crossing in the prison's history. And it cuts both ways, which is why it belongs in the middle of this video rather than at the end of it. Scott reached land and was in no condition to do anything at all when he got there. He was hypothermic and barely conscious, he could not stand, and he was back on the island the same day. He proved the distance was survivable, and simultaneously proved that surviving it is not the same as escaping. That is the whole case in one incident. Everything about the 1962 escape that people argue over is really an argument about margins. Whether a raft and 3 men in June, with equipment and a plan and a 7-hour head start, sat on the better side of a line that John Paul Scott crossed by inches with nothing. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps us keep making these, and there is a new case every day. And if there is a case you have always wanted looked at properly, leave it in the comments. That is where most of these start. The Bureau worked the case for 17 years. That is not a token file left open in a drawer. It ran leads across the country and abroad. It watched the Anglin family for years. It checked every unidentified body in the region that could plausibly fit. and it followed up every reported sighting, of which there were a great many and not one of which held. The shape of that search is worth understanding because it explains why the silence carries the weight the Bureau gave it. Fugitive investigations do not usually end with a capture. They end when a man uses his own name for something: a driving license, a hospital admission, an arrest for something small, a body in a county morgue with prints on file. The Bureau was not really hunting three men across a continent. It was waiting with the most complete identification file it had on anybody for one of them to touch a system. Over 17 years, none of the three ever did. 17 years is a very long time to look for three men who had no money, no documents, and no organization waiting for them, and who had been photographed and fingerprinted more thoroughly than almost anybody else alive at the time. The file was closed on the last day of 1979. The conclusion was that the three men had most probably drowned in the bay, and the matter was passed to the United States Marshals Service, which is where federal fugitive cases go and where this one has stayed ever since. The Bureau's reasoning was not lazy, and it deserves to be stated at its strongest. The men were not experienced watermen. The raft was homemade, and it demonstrably came apart because pieces of it were recovered in two different places. The water was cold and the tide was moving. And three career criminals with no resources vanished permanently without ever surfacing in the one place such men reliably surface, which is a police record somewhere else in the world. Michael Dyke, the deputy marshal who carried the case for years, has taken a different position, and the Marshals Service has never adopted the Bureau's conclusion. The argument is the mirror image of it. No bodies were recovered in a bay that routinely gives bodies back. The sealed bag came ashore intact and dry, and an open fugitive case costs almost nothing to maintain against the possibility that somebody is still out there. Alan West, incidentally, never got out of anywhere again. He was returned to the federal system, and he died in a prison in Florida in 1978, a year before the Bureau closed the file on the men who left without him. In 2013, a letter arrived at a police station in San Francisco. It was not made public until 2018, and when it was, it restarted the entire argument from the beginning. The letter opened without any preamble at all. "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris." It went on to claim that the writer was old and in poor health, that Morris had died in the 2000s and Clarence some years before that, and it offered a straightforward trade, a short sentence and medical treatment in exchange for coming in. It was tested, handwriting, fingerprints and DNA were all examined, and the reported result was inconclusive on every one of them, not a confirmation and not an exclusion. Which is, depending on temperament, either the most frustrating outcome available or exactly what anybody should expect from a single sheet of paper of unknown provenance, handled by an unknown number of people. The family have made their own claims across the decades, and they should be reported without either endorsing or dismissing them. Christmas cards said to have arrived in the years immediately after. A brother said to have made a deathbed statement in 2010 that he had been in contact. A photograph produced in 2015 said to show the two brothers in Brazil in 1975, which some analysts considered a plausible likeness and others did not. The authorities took some of it seriously enough to act on. When the brother's mother died in 1973, and again when other family funerals came round, marshals watched who arrived, on the straightforward reasoning that a man who will not write home might still come to bury his mother. That surveillance has produced its own folklore, including a long-repeated claim about two unusually tall women at the graveside, which has never been substantiated and which nobody has ever been able to source properly. There have also been attempts to settle it with genetics, comparing family reference samples against remains that might fit. Those have been reported as inconclusive as well, which by now will not surprise you. Every strand of this case has the same texture, enough to sustain a belief, never enough to close one. And none of that family material is evidence in the sense the word is used in a case file. All of it is exactly what a devoted family would produce whether the men lived or not. That is the difficulty with this whole category of material. It is consistent with both answers, which means it discriminates between them not at all. In 2014, a group of Dutch engineers did the arithmetic on the water, and it is the most useful thing anybody has added to this case in 50 years. Researchers at Delft University of Technology built a hydrodynamic model of San Francisco Bay and ran the raft through the actual tidal conditions of that night, hundreds of times over, at different launch times. The modeling produced a narrow answer. A launch between about 11 at night and midnight could have carried the raft northeast and put it on the Marin shore, somewhere around Horseshoe Bay. Launch appreciably earlier or later, and the ebb took everything straight out through the Golden Gate and into the Pacific, which is not survivable. The window they identified was about an hour wide. 1 hour out of a night they had spent 6 months preparing for decided whether they lived. And nobody knows what time they put the raft in the water, because the only witness who could have said was Alan West, and West was still in his cell. The model also made a prediction that fits the physical record uncomfortably well. If they launched inside the window and came ashore at Marin, debris released from the raft at that point would drift back and wash up around Angel Island, which is precisely where the paddle and the sealed bag of family photographs were found. That is not proof, and the researchers did not present it as proof. What it is a demonstration that the surviving evidence is fully consistent with them having made it, and equally consistent with a raft coming apart in the dark. That is the honest summary of this case, and it always has been. The modeling did not answer the question. It moved the question from whether the crossing was possible to what time they got in the water, and that is a much smaller question with no witness to it. So where does that leave it 60 years on? 3 men are still listed as fugitives. The Marshals will keep the case open until John Anglin would turn 99, which falls at the end of this decade, and at that point it closes on the calendar, whatever anybody believes. There is a reason the popular version of this story is so hard to shift, and it is a matter of timing. The film that fixed it in everybody's head came out in 1979, the same year the Bureau closed its file. So the version most people carry was assembled for a cinema audience at precisely the moment the investigation stopped producing anything new, and it has had no competition since. Almost every detail in this video was already documented by then. It simply lost the argument to a better told story, which is the ordinary fate of case files. Alcatraz itself did not last a year longer than they did. It closed in March 1963, on cost grounds that had been building for a decade and a structure that was failing faster than anybody wanted to pay to fix. The decision was signed off by Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, and the arithmetic behind it was the arithmetic in this video. A prison that cost 3 times as much as any other, on an island with no water, in a building that needed replacing outright. The timing has always invited the obvious reading, and the obvious reading is not quite fair to anybody involved, though it is easy to see why it stuck. My own reading, for what it is worth, is that the tidal modeling shifts this from a story about whether men could survive that water into a much narrower question about what time they got into it, and that the dry, sealed bag on Angel Island has never sat comfortably with drowning. But I hold that loosely. The Bureau's argument about the silence of the following 63 years is a strong one, and I cannot answer it. It is worth naming what would actually settle it, because it is a short list and none of it is likely. Remains identified. A verified fingerprint or a confirmed genetic match to a living man. A document trail somewhere abroad that survives being pulled at. Nothing else will do it, and everything else this case has produced in 6 decades has been material that comforts whichever answer you already held. That is not a complaint about the people who have worked it. It is what happens when a question comes down to 1 unobserved hour, and the only man who could have timed it was locked in a cell on the wrong side of a grill that would not move. You have now seen everything either agency had. 2 federal organizations read that same short list of objects and came to opposite conclusions, and neither has ever moved. So put your answer in the comments and say what would change your mind, because that second part is the one that tells you whether you are actually reasoning about it or just picking a side.